Viewers from megacities like Shanghai or Sao Paulo may dismiss towns like North Petherton as of no importance. It has just over 6,000 inhabitants who could easily fit into a large skyscraper. Yet it has a long and interesting history, being a market town with an annual carnival and once operated a Saxon mint. Today, it is a dormitory town for commuters working in nearby Taunton and Bridgewater. Before it was classified as a town, it claimed to be the largest village in England. On the 3rd of January, a murder-suicide of a young family is still reported in the local media. Over to you, James, to describe the awful event.
It was the 3rd of January 1913, and the people of the Somerset village of North Petherton were going about their normal daily lives, and took little notice of the young man bicycling through the village with a parcel under his arm. They were oblivious to the horrible events that will shortly be played out in full view of all the villagers in front of a small cottage near to the church. The neatly kept property on the corner of Mill Street belonged to a respectable middle-aged couple, Mr. and Mrs. Spiller. Both were at work that day, he as a mason's labourer and his wife, who was a laundress. The only people who were at home were his daughter Alice Ateo and her young daughter Frances, who was 20 months old. It was mid-morning, and the local baker was doing his usual delivery rounds, and called at the Spillers' home with his delivery. He continued on his way to the next stop, when he heard a man shouting behind him. When he looked around, he saw a person standing on the doorstep of the cottage that he had just left, and thinking the man wanted some additional bread, he gestured that he would be back in a few minutes. A neighbour who lived in the house opposite happened to be looking out of her front window, when she saw the man appear on the doorstep and look up and down the street in a furtive way, as if to see if there was anyone around. The neighbour noticed that the man was carrying the toddler Frances in his arms. The stranger then sat down in the doorway and clasped the child between his legs. It was then that a gunshot was heard. The horrified neighbour rushed out of her front door, and as she crossed the road was closely followed by another neighbour who had obviously heard the sound of a gun, just as another shot rang out. By the time they had reached the front door of the cottage, the stranger was sprawled backwards across the threshold, with the child lying motionless between his legs, with blood leaking slowly from a wound in her forehead. A small crowd started to gather to witness this horrific scene, and a short time later the local policeman and a doctor arrived. They found that the man was still alive, but unresponsive and breathing heavily. With the help of the local baker, the police constable picked up the injured man and carried him inside the house. As they entered, the inside of the cottage seemed perfectly normal and undisturbed, as it should have been. It looked like a small meal was in the process of being made. It was then that the two men saw the body of Alice sprawled face down on the floor in a pool of blood. The doctor, by the name of Hawkins, who lived in the village, made a quick examination of Alice Ateo's body, where it lay on the kitchen floor, and said he was unable to find a gunshot wound, giving his opinion that she died from a broken neck. It was only at a later and more detailed post-mortem examination that a bullet wound on the nape of the neck was found. Shockingly, she was shot from behind, the bullet having caused her neck to be broken. Hawkins also examined the man, who was put on a bed in a downstairs room. His pulse was weak, and the doctor felt he would not live much longer. He died at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, without ever regaining consciousness. The man, as it turned out, was Frank Ateo, aged 26. Alice, who was 21, was his estranged wife, and the little girl was their daughter. Ateo had been born in nearby Middlezoy and educated at the local school, where he was a steady, reliable pupil whose cheerful ways endeared him to his teachers and fellow schoolgoers alike. But his sunny appearance hid a fiery temper, and he was always quick to front up to anyone who annoyed him, regardless of their relative age or size. His temper, together with his physical strength, gave rise to the nickname of Lion, by which his friends would usually call him. When he left school, he got a job as a farm worker. But after a relatively short stay there, he returned to Somerset, where soon after his return he met Alice, who at the time was 19 years old, and it gave Frank a reason to settle down. They were married at the church in Middlezoy, and it was on Alice's 20th birthday that their daughter was born. Frank had found work on a farm just outside North Petherton, where he lived with his wife and daughter until November 1912. Ateo had previously been convicted of drunkenness and assaulting a police officer, for which he received small fines. Stupidly, he refused to pay and was sent to prison for 21 days. When in prison, he spoke to a police officer and alleged that his wife was responsible for supplying the police with the information that led him to be imprisoned. He was assured that this was not the case, but Ateo was unshakable in his beliefs and also implied that his wife had been unfaithful to him. It was rumoured that Alice was pregnant again, and Frank doubted that the baby was his. "After this is over," he told the police officer, "you will have me here for something more serious than this." Because he was in prison, he lost his job, as well as the tied house that came with it, where he had been living with his family for a year. It was in early December 1912, a few days before her husband's sentence, that Alice and a baby moved into the property in Mill Street with her mother and stepfather. After Ateo was released, he soon found another farm job, but since it did not come with any accommodation, he was forced to move back to live with his parents in Middlezoy. The marriage had apparently been a bit rocky for some time, and Frank had often been overheard threatening his wife, although it was widely believed that these were empty threats, which he would never actually follow through. He had recently seemed to be on much friendlier terms with his estranged wife, visiting her regularly and giving her money for the maintenance of herself and Francis. The previous week it did seem that the couple were thinking about a reconciliation. Frank's father thought he was depressed, and Alice had complained to her mother that Frank had acted badly since leaving prison, and that he had even hit her. Those villagers who had seen Frank arriving in North Petherton on the morning of the tragedy all thought that the gun was recently purchased, since it appeared to be very neatly wrapped. A witness had seen a young man, who he later identified as Frank, attempting to buy a revolver at an ironmonger's in Bridgewater on the morning of the murders. The shop owner had asked for his gun licence before allowing him to purchase the gun, and Frank had promised to bring it into the shop the following day. Asked why he wanted the gun, Ateo said that he wanted it to kill rabbits. The shop owner refused to sell him the gun without first seeing a valid licence, so he had left the shop empty-handed. Later on that morning, he had gone to another ironmonger's and asked if they kept pistols. When he was told by the shop assistant that they did not, he turned his attention to a rack of rifles, picking one up and asking what the price was. It was 19 shillings and 6 pence, which he said was too expensive, so he was shown a cheaper rifle costing 11 shillings and 6 pence, of a type that was commonly known in those days as a garden gun, frequently used by young people for target practice. It was really only suitable for killing small birds and squirrels, and was thought to be too innocent a weapon to be used for murder, and so did not require a gun licence. Frank spent a total of 12 shillings on the small rifle and some cartridges. He was described as being calm and rational as he chose his murder weapon, and nobody had any inkling of what he planned to do with it once purchased. Since he had deliberately chosen a time when he knew that Alice's mother would be away at her laundry job to make his fateful visit, he had purchased the weapon only shortly before carrying out the murders. The coroner's inquest heard the shooting of Alice and her daughter had been carried out extremely quickly and efficiently. Baker had spoken to Alice on her doorstep during his delivery, and he had not seen any sign of Ateo himself, but he did notice a bicycle propped up against the wall, with a brown paper parcel tied to it, and he had heard the child somewhere inside the cottage saying "Daddy." Before he had finished his deliveries and travelled further down the street, he had been hailed by Ateo, and turned to see him standing on the doorstep, by which time Ateo had shot and killed his wife. Within seconds he had shot his daughter, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on himself. The coroner's inquiry into the deaths lasted a day. After the jury had deliberated, they returned a verdict that Frank Ateo had wilfully murdered his wife Alice and their daughter Frances, and then taken his own life. They could not find any evidence to suggest that he was out of his mind at the time of the killing, leaving the coroner to pronounce the verdict malicious self-murder on the husband. It is curious to note that North Petherton had been the location of another similar incident some years earlier. In January 1897, a Charles Roach cut the throats of his wife Elizabeth and 10-month-old daughter Jessie with a razor before using the weapon to slash his own throat. Unlike Ateo, Roach survived to be tried at the court in Wells for the murder of his wife and his daughter. He was found guilty, but also insane, and was detained indefinitely at Her Majesty's pleasure. Now, John, this is a very tragic tale. What do you make of it?
Mercifully, the death of a family followed by the suicide of the perpetrator is very rare. It is called familicide. It usually occurs with white males who have access to a gun, and jealousy is part of the equation. The famous sociologist Emil Durkheim discussed this in his seminal work on suicide. He coined the phrase anomic suicide, where a person undertakes this course of action following a significant change to his social and economic position. Emil Durkheim's work has been subject to later revision, but Frank Ateo's behaviour certainly underscores his theory. Ateo was a model citizen. He had a young family, worked hard, and had use of a tight cottage. But this ended when he was sentenced to 21 days hard labour for getting drunk and assaulting a police officer. On his release, he lost his job with the Tide Cottage and had to move back to his parents in nearby Middlesoy. In addition to his reduced status, he developed jealousy towards his wife, who was pregnant at the time. He claimed the young-born baby was not his, a classic case of anomic suicide. If you would like to know more about this episode and the other West Country murders in this series, you can visit our website vintagemurders.uk or on our YouTube channel.